The needle glinted faintly in the wavering candlelight. Its tip flashed silver each time Priscilla's thin fingers pulled thread through the satin folds of a gown that would never touch her skin. She bent low over the fabric, her face drawn with exhaustion, whispering a prayer no one could hear. The room around her smelled of wax and starch, heavy with the perfume Eleanor Whitfield liked to spray across her dresses. The scent clung to Priscilla's rags, mingling with the sweat of her long day, mocking her with sweetness she could never claim. Priscilla was young, no more than 20 summers, though years of toil made her appear older. Her palms were calloused from years of work, her knuckles cracked from constant needle pricks. She had been told since childhood that she was blessed with nimble fingers, a blessing that meant endless nights spent sewing gowns for the mistress and her daughters while her own clothing rotted from her body. Each stitch felt like a chain tightening, yet the needle was her companion, her skill, her curse. Outside the window, cicadas droned in the Georgia heat. The plantation slept, but Priscilla did not. She was forced to finish 2 gowns by dawn, Eleanor had said, lest the Lord punish idleness. The mistress's voice still echoed in her skull, that measured, honeyed tone she used to cover cruelty in scripture. Eleanor Whitfield, wife of a wealthy planter, carried her Bible like a weapon. Every lash she ordered, every punishment she devised was cloaked in words of God. She sang hymns on Sunday mornings, lips curved in pious devotion, and by evening those same lips whispered orders to strip Priscilla to her shift and tie her to the post for the whip. Priscilla stitched and prayed, "Lord, deliver me. Lord, hear me in silence. Lord, let my hands be free one day." She could not stop herself from remembering the last punishment. A mistake so small, one seam uneven, a sleeve cut slightly shorter. Eleanor had seen it at once, her sharp eyes finding fault as if trained to search for imperfection. She had dragged Priscilla by the wrist across the sewing room, past the stares of the housemaids, into the parlor where the family gathered for evening prayer. With her own delicate hands, Eleanor spilled a bowl of uncooked rice onto the floor. "Kneel," she commanded. Priscilla obeyed. She sank onto the rice, every grain like a knife under her knees. The pain was immediate, sharp, and growing heavier with each breath. Eleanor forced her to remain there through the entire prayer service, an hour, then another, her daughters smirking, her husband silent. Hymns rose around her, voices praising mercy and grace, while Priscilla's blood seeped into the wooden floor. She kept her head bowed, biting her lip until it bled, whispering words only God might hear. "Do not let me break." Not yet. When Eleanor finally allowed her to rise, Priscilla's legs buckled. Her knees bore raw, crimson circles that would scar for weeks. Eleanor had looked down at her and smiled. "The wages of sloth are pain. Remember that, girl." Priscilla did remember. She remembered every lash of the whip, every blow to her back when her stitches were not straight enough, every slap across her cheek when she dared to look away from her mistress's gaze. Her body carried these memories in scars and bruises, yet her spirit carried something Eleanor could not see, a quiet flame, faint but unbroken. That night, as she stitched by candlelight, Priscilla's eyes shifted toward the doorway. She half expected Eleanor to appear again, to scold her for sewing too slowly. But the hall was empty, only shadows. She let out a shaky breath. Her hands trembled with exhaustion, yet the needle never faltered. She had been taught since childhood that mistakes meant punishment, and she had learned too well. Each dress she crafted was flawless, pearls sewn onto bodices, lace gathered at sleeves, hems smooth and straight. Eleanor would wear them to church, praised by neighbors for her refinement. "A God-fearing woman," they said, blind to the cruelty hidden behind polished hymns and gleaming fabric. No one saw the bleeding fingers that stitched those gowns, the young woman who whispered freedom into every thread. Sometimes, when the house was still, Priscilla imagined what freedom might feel like. She pictured herself in a dress of her own making, not satin or silk but plain calico, strong enough for work yet her own. She imagined walking barefoot through soil without chains, her knees unscarred, her hands free to hold something other than a needle. Yet every morning the fantasy faded with the rising sun, replaced by Aliner's commands. Aliner's cruelty was not random. It was deliberate, crafted like the sermons she recited. On Sundays, she would read from the book of Ephesians. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." Then she would close her Bible, smile sweetly, and later force Priscilla to work through the night. "The Lord gave you hands for labor," she would say, as though God himself had destined Priscilla to bleed for Aliner's gowns. Yet Priscilla's hands told a different story. They were scarred, yes, but they were also steady, skilled. They could create beauty from fabric, shape gowns that turned Aliner into the envy of Savannah ladies. Hands like that, Priscilla thought, were not meant to serve cruelty forever. She told herself this when the nights grew unbearable, when her knees throbbed from rice, when her back burned from lashes. These hands are mine. One day they will make something for me. The candle burned low. The gown draped across her lap gleamed white in the dim light, a cruel purity. She pressed her lips together, whispering once more, "Deliver me, Lord." For a moment, the silence in the room thickened, as if the air itself listened. Priscilla's heart beat hard against her ribs. She looked at the needle in her hand, so small, so fragile, yet capable of piercing flesh. She pushed the thought away quickly, fear rushing in. If Aliner ever knew the shadows of such thoughts, punishment would be worse than anything she had endured. Still, the image lingered like smoke after a candle's flame, and so she stitched, silent, unbroken, scarred yet still breathing. The night passed in the rustle of fabric and the faint pricking of the needle, a lullaby of pain and endurance. Priscilla's life, bound by thread and lash, was a tapestry of suffering. Yet beneath it ran a hidden seam of resilience, invisible but strong. No hymn, no lash, no kneeling on rice could tear it loose. For while Aliner believed she had shackled Priscilla with piety and cruelty, she had only sharpened the flame inside her. The shackles held fast for now, but the silence they demanded would not last forever. Sunday mornings on the Whitfield plantation carried a strange hush. The fields fell silent, the overseer's whip coiled at his side, and the house prepared itself for worship. To an outsider, it might have seemed like peace, but for the enslaved, it was a different kind of torment, one wrapped in scripture and sanctimony. The chapel stood at the edge of the property, a small whitewashed building with peeling paint. Its bell cracked but still rung each Sabbath. The Whitfields sat in the front pew, pressed into their finery, lace gloves, satin gowns, polished shoes gleaming in the morning light. Behind them, crammed into the back benches, sat the enslaved. Their clothes were ragged, their backs bent from labor, but they were forced to sit upright, eyes forward, mouths shut. Priscilla was among them, her legs trembling from the previous night's work. Her fingers still ached from endless sewing, but she dared not shift or rub her hands. Aliner Whitfield's gaze roamed the chapel like a hawk's, searching for weakness. The service began with hymns. Aliner's voice rose loudest, pure and clear, ringing with a piety that made her neighbors nod in admiration. She sang as though she believed every word, as though cruelty and devotion could flow from the same lips without contradiction. Priscilla bowed her head, lips moving soundlessly. The words of the hymns caught in her throat. Then Aliner rose to speak. The plantation preacher often allowed her the pulpit. After all, she carried herself with authority, and her husband funded the church. She placed her gloved hands on the lectern and opened her Bible with theatrical care. Ephesians chapter 6, she declared, her voice steady, sharp as a blade. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. A murmur of approval rippled through the white congregation. Eleanor closed her eyes as though anointed with holy fire. "This is God's law," she said. "To rebel against your master is to rebel against the Lord himself. Obedience is salvation. Work is worship." Priscilla's stomach twisted. She had heard these words before, always from Eleanor's lips, each verse bent to justify another cruelty. Around her, the enslaved kept their eyes fixed on the floor. None dared look up, though the air was heavy with resentment, with a silence that spoke louder than prayer. When the service ended, the congregation lingered, exchanging greetings. Eleanor's daughters giggled in their gowns, and her husband shook hands with neighbors. Then Eleanor's sharp eyes turned, fastening on Priscilla. "You, come here!" Priscilla froze. The room hushed. Slowly, she rose from the back bench and walked forward, her bare feet echoing on the wooden floor. Eleanor's hand shot out, gripping her arm like iron. "This girl," Eleanor said to the gathered crowd, "must learn the Lord's lesson in diligence." From her pocket, she drew a handful of sewing pins, gleaming, slender, cruel. She pressed one into Priscilla's arm, sharp enough to break skin. Priscilla flinched but did not cry out. A small bead of blood rose, bright against her dark skin. "She grows slothful," Eleanor announced. "So I prick her as one pricks a conscience." The room was silent, some parishioners uncomfortable, others smiling in approval. Eleanor pricked her again, higher this time on the shoulder. "Do you feel it, girl?" "Yes, mistress," Priscilla whispered, her voice trembling. "Good. Pain is God's reminder to work harder." When Eleanor released her, Priscilla staggered back, blood speckling her sleeve. The congregation turned away, pretending not to notice, their hymns of mercy already forgotten. Later that day, Priscilla returned to the sewing room. She carried in her hands a small kerchief she had stitched from scraps, an act of quiet defiance, a thing made for herself. Eleanor found it. She held it up, eyes narrowing. "What is this?" "My kerchief, mistress," Priscilla whispered. "Your kerchief." Eleanor's voice dripped with venom. "You dare waste thread on yourself while my daughter's gown lies unfinished." She crossed to the fireplace, tossed the kerchief into the flames, and watched it curl and blacken. Slaves own nothing. Not thread, not cloth, not even the breath in your chest. Remember that. Priscilla watched the fire consume her work, the only thing she had made for herself in years. She clenched her fists until her nails dug into her palms, but she said nothing. Silence was survival. The week dragged forward. Eleanor's daughter was soon to be wed, and the house buzzed with preparations. For Priscilla, it meant endless hours at the needle. She was ordered to fast, denied meals so that her hands would not grow sluggish with food. Her body weakened, her head spun, but she worked. She stitched lace and silk into patterns of perfection while her own ribs jutted sharper each day. One evening, as the candle burned low, Eleanor swept into the sewing room. Her face was pale and sharp, her eyes glinting with suspicion. "You put curses in the stitches," she hissed. Priscilla looked up, startled. "No, mistress, I—" The slap came fast, stinging across her cheek. Eleanor struck her again, harder. "Do not lie, I feel it. These seams, this thread, it carries rebellion." Tears stung Priscilla's eyes, but she bowed her head. "I only stitch as you ask, mistress." Eleanor leaned close, her breath hot with rage. "You forget who holds the thread of your life." From her pocket, she drew a single needle. She seized Priscilla's hand, spreading her palm wide. Without hesitation, she jabbed the needle deep into the soft flesh. Priscilla gasped, her body jolting in pain. Blood welled around the silver, dripping down her wrist. "Do you feel it?" Alina whispered. "This is my hand. My will, you live because I let you. Never forget." She withdrew the needle, leaving a small puncture that throbbed with agony. Then she dropped the bloodied steel onto Priscilla's lap. "Stitch faster, or next time I will drive it through your tongue." When Alina swept out of the room, Priscilla sat trembling, her hand clenched around the bloody needle. She stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. The pain burned, but beneath it something else stirred, something sharper than fear. For years, the needle had been her prison, the tool of her bondage. But in that moment, Priscilla saw it differently. It was small, yes, but it pierced flesh. It drew blood. In Alina's hands, it was torment. In Priscilla's hands, it could be something else. Her palm ached, her heart raced, but her mind was clear. She whispered into the empty room, her voice hoarse but steady. "One day, Mistress. One day the needle will answer you." The night pressed down heavy on the Whitfield plantation, a darkness broken only by the moon and the faint glow of candles behind shuttered windows. Most of the household slept, but in the sewing room, Priscilla sat alone. Her hands moved swiftly, the thread sliding smooth through silk, but her mind was not on the gown in her lap. Beneath the folds of fabric, hidden deep in the hem of her skirt, lay a single steel embroidery needle. Sharper than most, longer too, it was the kind Alina reserved for her most intricate work. Priscilla had palmed it days before when Alina wasn't looking, slipping it into her clothing with a sleight of hand so practiced no one noticed. Since then, it had become her secret companion, her talisman. Each night when the house fell silent, she drew it out and studied it under the faint candlelight. She tested its weight between her fingers, rolling it against her skin, feeling it sting when she pressed too hard. At first, her hands trembled. Fear always made them tremble. But gradually, she steadied. She practiced her grip in silence, whispering to herself as she worked. "Not a stitch, not a hem, a strike." The words became a rhythm, a prayer of their own. Other enslaved people began to notice her distant gaze, the way her fingers curled protectively over her skirts. One evening, as they drew water from the well, an older woman named Lottie leaned close and whispered, "Child, I see the fire in your eyes. Don't let it burn you alive. Revenge will mean death." Priscilla's lips tightened. Death without dignity is worse than death with justice. The older woman's eyes widened, then softened with sorrow. She pressed a hand to Priscilla's shoulder. "Then be ready, girl, ready to pay the price." Priscilla nodded. She had long known her life was not her own, not to Alina, not to anyone. Every lash, every needle driven into her skin had stripped her of fear. What remained was something else, sharp and unyielding. It was during those long, endless nights that Priscilla began to notice Alina's patterns. The mistress had a habit of kneeling for long prayers in her private parlor after the family retired. She would don one of her silk gowns, low-cut, designed to show her pale chest in candlelight, and fall to her knees before the family Bible. Her head bowed, her arms stretched wide, she would beg the Lord for blessings, for protection, for strength to rule her household with righteousness. The irony gnawed at Priscilla. Here was Alina, whispering to heaven for mercy, while her own heart was pitiless. She prayed for grace while ordering girls whipped until their backs split open. She prayed for humility while pricking Priscilla with pins for the entertainment of her neighbors. And yet, in that act of piety, Alina exposed her most vulnerable self, her chest rising and falling just inches above the open Bible, her heart unguarded. Priscilla thought of it often, her hand brushing against the hidden needle at her side. The very moments Alina believed herself closest to God were the moments she was most defenseless. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating, but Alina was not blind. She began to sense unease in the house, a creeping dread that whispered around corners. She grew paranoid, convinced that someone intended to curse her family. She paced the halls at night, muttering about dark spells and restless spirits. Her suspicion turned toward Priscilla. "You!" she snapped one afternoon, slamming fabric onto the sewing table. "Every garment you touch, I feel eyes upon me. You will stitch crosses into everything I wear, do you hear me? Crosses, so the Lord's power shields me." Priscilla bowed her head. "Yes, mistress." And so she stitched. But not in the way Alina imagined. Into every hem, every cuff, every lining, she wove symbols of her own making, tiny patterns, crooked stitches that looked ordinary to anyone else. They were not spells, not curses, but messages. A starburst in the corner of a gown, a crooked seam hidden inside a bodice, signs of defiance, reminders to herself that even within Alina's demands she could leave her mark. Sometimes, as she pulled the thread tight, Priscilla whispered beneath her breath, "This is mine. Not hers. Mine." The needle in her pocket grew heavier with each passing day, as though it carried not only her secret but her destiny. She felt it when she walked, when she bent over her work, when she lay awake at night listening to Alina's footsteps creak across the upstairs floorboards. The tension in the household grew thick. Alina's paranoia deepened. She demanded that every servant cross themselves before entering her chambers, that prayers be read aloud while meals were served. She ordered more lashings for smaller faults, convinced that disobedience spread like rot if not cut out quickly. But Priscilla no longer felt the sting of fear in the same way. Each punishment only hardened her resolve. When Alina struck her across the face for looking proud, Priscilla's lips stayed pressed together, her eyes unblinking. When she was denied meals for failing to finish a seam fast enough, she sewed through her hunger, her hands steady, her mind elsewhere. At night, in the stillness of her pallet, she clutched the needle close to her chest, whispering into the dark, "One day, one strike, and she will bleed as I have bled." Her fellow enslaved sometimes heard her murmuring and shook their heads. They were afraid, not just of what Alina might do, but of what the world would do to a woman who dared rise against her mistress. Yet even in their fear, some could not hide the flicker of admiration in their eyes. They had seen her endure torment and still stand tall. They had seen her bleed and not break. It was as though Priscilla herself had become a needle, small, overlooked, but sharp enough to pierce deep when the moment came. One evening, while repairing one of Alina's gowns, she pricked her finger. A single drop of blood fell onto the silk. She stared at it for a long moment, then pressed her thumb to smear it across the fabric, hiding the mark within the seam. The sight of it filled her with a grim clarity. The needle did not belong to Alina. It belonged to her, and when the time came, it would not stitch cloth. It would stitch justice. The days stretched on, each one heavy with silence, with Alina's voice rising in prayer, with Priscilla's hands weaving patterns only she understood. The air in the house felt charged, as though a storm gathered just beyond the horizon. And always, beneath it all, the needle waited. No longer just a tool, no longer just an instrument of pain. It was a judgment, sharp and patient, biding its time in the hem of Priscilla's skirt. When Alina knelt in her parlor, chest rising and falling in prayer, Priscilla's eyes lingered on the curve of her body, the vulnerable rhythm of her breath. Each night the image grew sharper, the path clearer. The house prayed for mercy. But Priscilla prayed for something else. She prayed for the strength to make the final stitch. The air in the Whitfield parlor was heavy with the scent of oil lamps and the rustle of hymnals. It was evening, the time Alina reserved for family prayers, when the household was summoned to kneel and recite scripture until the candles guttered low. Tonight felt different. Priscilla sensed it in the stillness of the walls, in the way the shadows bent across the floorboards, in the tautness of her own breath. The enslaved stood in the back, their heads bowed, their eyes lowered. Eleanor and her family occupied the front, as always, framed in flickering lamplight. The mistress knelt on her embroidered cushion, Bible opened before her. She had chosen a gown of ivory silk, its neckline low, its bodice pressed tight as though to display her body even in piety. Her hands clasped the Bible, her lips moved in fervent whisper. Priscilla was ordered to remain close, a basket of sewing supplies at her side, in case the gown tore or the hem fell. Eleanor often demanded this, an enslaved seamstress on hand, ready to patch a garment even during worship. Tonight, Priscilla obeyed without a word. She stood in the shadows, her head slightly bowed, though her eyes never left her mistress. The hymns faded, replaced by whispered prayers. The room sank into a suffocating quiet, broken only by Eleanor's voice as she pleaded with heaven for mercy and favor. Her daughters knelt beside her, heads bowed. Her husband sat stiff-backed, hands folded. The enslaved behind them murmured responses, their voices low, forced, afraid. But Priscilla was not afraid. Not tonight. She felt the weight of the needle hidden in her palm, its steel cool and sharp. For weeks it had slept in the hem of her skirt, her secret companion, her promise. Tonight, she had drawn it out and held it ready, pressing its tip into her hand until her skin burned with its presence. Her heart beat steady, her breath slow. It felt as though she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Eleanor's voice rose, trembled, broke. She bent forward over the Bible, her pale chest gleaming in the lamplight, her head bowed in exaggerated devotion. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving. She was exposed, unguarded. The irony seared Priscilla's mind. Eleanor praying for mercy she had never given, bearing the very heart she had never shown. Priscilla's steps were slow, deliberate. The boards creaked beneath her bare feet. At first no one noticed. The prayers drowned the sound, the room was lost in ritual. Only the flame of the lamps seemed to waver as she moved. She came to stand just behind Eleanor's shoulder. Her shadow fell across the open Bible. Eleanor shifted slightly but did not open her eyes. Priscilla raised her hand. The needle caught the lamplight, flashing once like a star. Her breath stilled, and then she struck. The steel drove clean and silent through silk and flesh, straight into Eleanor's heart. It was not the flailing chaos of violence, but the precision of a seamstress completing her final stitch. Eleanor gasped, sharp and terrible. Her eyes flew open wide, her lips parted, but no sound came except a choking breath. Her body convulsed once, twice, then collapsed forward, pressing her chest against the open Bible. Blood spilled across the thin pages, red staining the scripture. For a moment the room was silent. Absolute silence. Then screams tore through the air. Eleanor's daughters shrieked, their cries piercing. Her husband stumbled to his feet, shouting incoherently. The enslaved in the back froze, wide-eyed, too stunned even to breathe. "She's struck down," someone cried. "The Lord has struck her down." Others shouted prayers, clutching their children, crossing themselves. To many it seemed divine punishment, a holy judgment descending in the very moment of prayer. Priscilla did not move. She stood above Eleanor's body, the needle still in her hand, her face calm. She looked not like a servant caught in rebellion, but like a craftsman finishing her life's work. Her eyes were steady, her lips pressed into silence. The room erupted in chaos. Servants rushed forward. Eleanor's daughters sobbed and clutched their mother's arms. The master shouted for order, for a doctor, for anything to undo what had already been done. But Aliner's body lay still, her breath gone, her blood soaking into the sacred book she had wielded as a weapon for so long. Through it all, Priscilla did not flee. She did not weep. She did not beg. She stood tall, her posture proud, the needle glinting in her hand. Her gaze swept across the room, across the horrified faces, across the enslaved who stared with awe and terror. She whispered, almost to herself, but the words seemed to echo in the silence. The final stitch. For years she had bent under lashes, knelt on rice until her knees bled, endured slaps, pricks, hunger. She had stitched gowns she could never wear, garments meant to glorify the woman who owned her. And now she had sewn the last seam, the seam that ended her tormentor's life. The congregation stumbled backward, torn between fear and awe. Some shouted to seize her, others trembled too much to move. A few whispered that God himself had guided her hand. But Priscilla did not resist. She did not run. She lifted her chin, meeting the eyes of those who stared at her as if she were both executioner and prophet. In that moment, she looked less like a seamstress and more like judgment itself. The parlor spun in pandemonium, wailing, shouting, frantic prayers. Yet Priscilla stood at the center, unshaken, silent, as though the world had finally aligned with the truth she had always known, that no hymn could erase cruelty, no scripture could sanctify torment. Justice had come, not with thunder or fire, but with the quiet strike of a needle. The Bible beneath Aliner's body grew darker with blood, the ink blurring, the words dissolving. The family clutched one another, their cries rising, their faith unraveling. But Priscilla stood alone, needle in hand, serene. It was done. The room did not stay silent for long. The moment Aliner's body collapsed upon the Bible, pandemonium swept through the Whitfield parlor. Screams echoed off the walls, prayers tumbled into curses, and feet scrambled across the polished wood. Priscilla did not move. She stood as she had in the instant of the strike, tall, unflinching, the needle still glinting in her hand. But her stillness was short-lived. Rough hands seized her shoulders, dragging her backward. Shouts rang out, "Chain her! Devil's work!" She murdered the mistress. The blows came fast. A fist to her jaw, a kick to her ribs. The needles slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Her body folded beneath the strikes, yet she did not cry out. Pain was no stranger to her. It greeted her now like an old companion. They bound her wrists in iron. Chains coiled around her ankles. Blood trickled from her lip, staining her ragged dress. Even then, her face remained calm, her eyes unclouded. But outside those parlor walls, the story began to spread. Among the enslaved in the quarters, whispers sparked like fire in dry grass. They passed from mouth to mouth, voice to voice. Priscilla stitched justice into her mistress's heart. The words carried weight. Some repeated them in awe, others in fear. A few shook their heads, warning that such defiance meant only death. Yet none could deny the power of it. That one enslaved woman, armed with nothing more than a needle, had brought down Aliner Whitfield in the very act of prayer. The Whitfield family's disgrace grew quickly. Neighbors came to call, not with comfort but with suspicion. Whispers slithered through parlors and pews. A mistress struck dead in her prayers, blood staining the Bible. Some claimed it was divine punishment. Others hissed that witchcraft had entered the Whitfield house. The daughter's wedding, once meant to be the grandest affair in the county, was canceled without announcement. Invitations lay discarded. The satin gown Priscilla had stitched shoved into a trunk, unwanted. No hymn could wash away the blood that had soaked those pages of scripture. No prayer could scrub the shame from the Whitfield name. Even the plantation chapel grew uneasy. The preacher's sermons faltered. He avoided Aliner's fate in his words, skipping over her name as though silence could erase memory. Yet the silence only made it louder. People claimed that when they prayed at night, they heard the faint sound of needles clicking, as if an invisible seamstress worked in the shadows. Priscilla was condemned swiftly. There was no trial worth its name, only an announcement of her guilt and her sentence. She was to die as an example, to remind others what rebellion would cost. They marched her to the gallows at dawn. The sky was streaked with crimson, the air heavy with dew. Chains rattled with each step she took, but she walked steady, her head lifted. The townsfolk gathered, their faces tense with horror and fascination. Some came out of duty, others out of morbid curiosity, still others because they had heard the whispers and wanted to see if the seamstress would falter. Priscilla did not falter. She mounted the steps with calm, her eyes scanning the crowd. Among the enslaved who stood at the edge, she caught the gaze of Lottie, the old woman who had once warned her. Tears streaked Lottie's cheeks, but in her eyes there was pride. When asked for last words, Priscilla's voice rang clear. Death without dignity is worse than death with justice. The rope tightened around her neck. The trapdoor opened. Silence fell heavy when her body stilled, broken only by the caw of a crow overhead. But death did not end her story. In the quarters, in the fields, in the kitchens and cabins, her name lived on. Children whispered of her as they lay on straw pallets. Elders spoke of her in low tones by the fire. They called her the seamstress who stitched justice. Some swore her spirit lingered in the chapel, kneeling where a leaner had fallen, the air heavy with the sound of breath that was not there. Others claimed that at night, when the house fell silent, you could hear the faint clicking of needles, stitching not cloth but memory. The Whitfields never recovered their standing. Their neighbors avoided them, their name was tainted, their wealth began to wither. The grand wedding was never rescheduled. Aliner's daughters married quietly, without fanfare, whispers trailing them like shadows. The parlor where Aliner died grew cold, unused, though no amount of scrubbing could erase the faint brown stain on the Bible. Years passed. The plantation faltered. The chapel, once the pride of the family, stood abandoned. Paint peeled, windows cracked, and weeds grew through its steps. Dust coated the pews, cobwebs shrouded the altar. Yet the air inside carried a weight, a hush that pressed on the chest of any who entered. Travelers claimed strange things. Some said they felt watched. Others swore they heard a faint, rhythmic sound, like thread pulled through cloth, like a needle piercing fabric again and again. On the pulpit, half buried in dust, lay a single rusted sewing needle. No one knew who had placed it there. Some said it had been left on the night of Aliner's death, others that it appeared years later, carried by a hand unseen. And so Priscilla's stitch remained, not of cloth, but of history. She had bound pain to justice, silence to defiance. Her name was not written in ledgers or sermons, but in whispers that carried through Georgia's fields, through nights heavy with memory. She had made her final stitch not in fabric, but in flesh, in scripture, in time itself. And though her body swung from the rope, her silence spoke louder than any hymn Aliner had ever sung. Priscilla's stitch endured, forever remembered in whispers, forever binding the pain of chains to the justice of one defiant hand. If this story of Priscilla moved you, let me ask, what would you have done in her place? Endure in silence or strike a final stitch of justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more untold stories of courage, vengeance, and history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next tale whispered through time.